Two women separated by 2,300 years faced the same impossible problem. Elizabeth I sharpened her quill and slowed the tide of the Thames, and Penelope set up her loom and unraveled the night away. Different tools, but the same strategy. Stall, stall, stall. Elizabeth stalled because marriage meant surrendering her crown, and Penelope did it because choosing a suitor meant surrendering her kingdom. But both understood that hesitation was a powerful political chess piece. And this is their power play of delay. Both Elizabeth and Penelope are famous for stalling for time. So Elizabeth's first instance of this that went platinum was the Tide Letter. We're not going to get into the details of the Wyatt Rebellion. What matters here is that Elizabeth's sister, Mary I, was queen. And in response to Wyatt's rebellion, Mary ordered Elizabeth to be taken to the Tower of London. Now remember, this is where Elizabeth's mother, Anne Boleyn, was imprisoned and beheaded. So it's an imprisonment that comes with a serious mental whiplash. And Elizabeth asks for an audience with her sister before going. It's denied. So then she asks to write a letter instead. So she's asking for an audience for her sister in the letter, but more importantly is how painfully slowly she writes it. So Elizabeth is deliberately taking so much time writing this letter to her sister that the low tide that's supposed to take her down the Thames, the Tower of London, that tide has risen so high that the boat can't safely travel under London Bridge. So she bought herself an extra day from going to the Tower of London. And with that tide letter, Elizabeth debuts her signature move. Let's shift gears ever so slightly from prison to marriage. So Mary I was married to Philip II of Spain. And when she died of cancer, Elizabeth became Queen Elizabeth I, and Philip asked Elizabeth to marry him. Now, keeping it all in the family was really on brand for Philip. Mary's mother, Catherine of Aragon, married Henry after she married his brother Arthur. And Philip, he was a Habsburg, and that family sent out wedding invitations for cousins for like 800 years. When folks marry their cousins in the US, we call them hillbillies. When they do it in Europe, we call them royalty. Anyway, Elizabeth turned him down about a year after he asked, and Philip suggested 4 other possible husbands for Elizabeth. But here, Elizabeth stalled, even more than she did with Philip. A few letters, a visit or two, but she wouldn't really commit one way or the other. Don Carlos of Spain, he waited more than 5 years. And that guy just died. She never did tell him anything. Now, if you read the Odyssey in high school, Penelope's whole elevator pitch is that all she does is weave a shroud and cry in her bedroom. So this shroud, crazy important. She's weaving a funeral shroud for King Laertes. All right, for starters, what's a funeral shroud? Well, short answer, big old piece of cloth. So in ancient times, before coffins were common, a shroud was used to wrap the body for a grave. So large enough to wrap up a whole adult. And because Laertes is king, this one's also pretty elaborate and decorative. So I'm sure it legit took a long time to weave. But Penelope's whole MO is to stall indefinitely. So she told her suitors that she would not marry one of them until she finishes King Laertes' funeral shroud. And you'll remember, every night she undid the stitches that she did that day. So I have Emily Wilson's translation of the Odyssey. And in here, it's in book 2. She says, she came up with a special trick. She fixed a mighty loom inside the palace hall. And weaving a fine long cloth, she said to us, young men, you are my suitors. And since my husband, the brave Odysseus, is dead, I know you want to marry me. You must be patient. I've worked hard weaving this winding sheet to bury good Laertes when he dies. He gained such wealth, the women would reproach me if he were to be buried with no shroud. Please let me finish it. And her words made sense to us. So every day she wove the mighty cloth, And then by night, by torchlight, she unwove it. So just like Elizabeth, Penelope was stalling rather than choosing someone to marry. So we've established that both women had similar stalling techniques. But why? And who's pushed them to get married? Well, this time let's begin with Penelope. She's not the main character of the Odyssey, so her storyline's a little more straightforward. So the suitors all assume that Odysseus is dead, and they want to be the king of Ithaca. Do you know where Ithaca is? So it's this really tiny island off the west coast of Greece. It's small, but strategically significant. There's this other island somewhere, I don't know, west coast of Europe. It's pretty small, but strategically significant. I can't remember the name of it right now. I'm sure it'll come to me. So it's pretty cut and dried. The suitors want power. We know that they're aristocrats, not commoners, and we can assume that they're not the heir apparent at home, like they wouldn't be there. So at best, they're probably third or fourth, fifth sons and pretty far removed from the line of succession in their own kingdoms. But if they marry a widowed queen, that's an instant title upgrade. So why isn't she saying yes? Well, canon says that she's waiting for Odysseus. She's still constantly crying over him. But can we do some math for a second? So Odysseus and Penelope meet at Helen's suitor contest. And they're married in Sparta immediately after Helen and Menelaus are married. And then they go to Ithaca. Their son Telemachus is an infant when that plow trick that sent Odysseus to Troy to the Trojan War. So Penelope knows Odysseus for 2 years, maybe 3 years before he left. And he's been gone for 20. Who's been running that place while Odysseus is gone? Because all the men of Ithaca, they went to Troy. It was a 10-year war. And so every healthy man between about 20 and 60, they're gone. And Penelope has to run the show because people still have to eat. But she can't be seen as running it because that's not what women do. And all those suitors. So saying no to any one of them could mean an attack. And an island full of women doesn't have an army. So politically, she can't do that. But saying yes to any of them also means saying no to the rest of them. So again, politically, she can't do it. It also means deferring to someone who's been drinking her wine and eating from her banquet hall for years after she's been independent, even if it was closeted independence. And saying yes also means Telemachus is probably going to be killed because he's just going to be in the way. So let's compare Penelope to Elizabeth, who is admittedly much more complex and there's more nuance there. Did you know that Parliament discussed Elizabeth's marriage as an official argument? There were arguments that request may be made to the Queen's Highness for marriage in the House of Commons in February 1559. Queen Elizabeth opened her first parliament in January of 1559. It took them an entire month to make her marriage a matter of national policy. Okay, but why? Why? So firstly, she was the last of the Tudor line, and nobody wanted another War of the Roses. So to protect the Tudor dynasty, Parliament wants her to marry a Protestant Englishman. Also, in Tudor England, it was taken for granted that a woman of Elizabeth's age should be married. The social order, hallowed by custom and endorsed by the Bible, was built around a framework where men were the authority figures and their wives' primary roles were childbearing and household management. A wealthy widow might enjoy a high degree of independence, but in the eyes of the law, married women were, to all intents and purposes, their husband's property. Accordingly, for the male population at least, the existence of a head of state who was female, unmarried, and the mistress of her own destiny was at the very least unsettling, and in a real sense, a challenge to the norms of society. So a delegation of Parliament sent a petition to make request for Her Highness for marriage. But the House noted their approval that they had not breached her prerogative by suggesting who she should marry. So she eloquently, in a beautiful Elizabethan way, told Parliament what she thought of their petition, saying, I happily chose this kind of life which I yet live, which I assure you hath been most acceptable to God. This shall be for me sufficient, that a marble stone shall declare that a queen, having reigned such a time, lived and died a virgin. So why'd she say no? Well, because a king outranks a queen. And if she married, then she would be relegated to baby maker, while her husband would be policymaker. And saying yes to anyone means saying no to somebody else. And politically, that could create enemies. So she wove her own funeral shroud and then picked it apart each night. And a member of Parliament called her out on it. He said, for if she should marry, then she should be but queen, whereas now she is both king and queen. So Stone was the first one to note, or at least the first one to say out loud, that it wasn't just about the succession. Elizabeth didn't want to marry because she liked being the one in the driver's seat. So y'all want to talk about religion for a minute? So early in her reign, Parliament created the Act of Supremacy, and within that was the Oath of Supremacy. So all clergy and officials were required to swear the Oath of Supremacy, and that acknowledges Elizabeth's authority over the church instead of the Pope. Refusal to take the oath meant loss of office, and repeated refusal could be treated as treason. So, of course, many Catholic priests and bishops refused to take the oath because that denied papal supremacy, and they were relieved of their positions inside churches. But this mass exodus left Elizabeth with a supply problem. Well, now there weren't enough Protestant clergy to fill all the available ministerial positions. And also, now that her sister Mary was gone, Protestant exiles were returning from places like Geneva and Zurich and well, they were a bit weird. They wanted vestments and altars and the episcopal hierarchy, all that, the whole thing gone. And Elizabeth was definitely more of a moderate. I mean, a lot of bake sales and spaghetti dinners went into raising money for that altar. It's pretty. Don't just go making firewood out of it. I feel like she probably had her head in her hands an awful lot. The Act of Supremacy also included a clause that clergy were not to be burdened with lay offices and offices of state. This is big. It deliberately excused the clergy from council seats and chancellorships. So this presented Elizabeth as a moderate ruler, and it was one of the first steps in separating church and state. So in the Odyssey, we see more of a general position of the thought of priests. So in book 22, Odysseus has come home and he's slaughtered over 100 suitors inside his home. A priest and a poet are among the only ones left inside his banquet hall. And so the poet, Phemius, is spared and allowed to live because a poet's role is sacred. But Odysseus kills Laertes, the priest. A priest that is tied to a corrupt patron is also corrupt. And then really quickly, let me just mention some other parallels and comparisons. Elizabeth I was on the receiving end of several assassination attempts during her reign. And this can be compared to Telemachus's return trip from Sparta, when Antinous, one of the suitors, tries to kill Telemachus. Cat Ashley was Elizabeth's lifelong governess, and when she became queen, Cat Ashley was appointed the chief gentlewoman of the Privy Chamber. And this was one of the most intimate and one of the most influential positions at court. And she can be compared to Eurycleia in the Odyssey. Eurycleia was Penelope's nurse, and she was the person who was closest to Penelope and in whom Penelope confided the most. And lastly, let's talk about William Cecil, Elizabeth I's counselor and mentor. He was her chief advisor. And historian A.F. Pollard writes that for 40 years, the biography of Cecil is almost indistinguishable from that of Elizabeth and from the history of England. He helped Elizabeth in shaping English domestic and foreign policy, in managing finances, and guiding Elizabeth through myriad crises, including all those assassination attempts. Mentor is an old friend of Odysseus who frequently advises and cares for Telemachus. Also, the goddess Athena often takes Mentor's form to advise and encourage Telemachus. That's why the word mentor today means counselor or guide. So it's several steps too far to say that Elizabeth I used the Odyssey as any sort of a playbook. It's more that the Penelope pieces of the Odyssey are fan fiction of Elizabeth I, written about 2,300 years beforehand. Elizabeth I was on the receiving end of several assassination attempts during her reign. Elizabeth I was on the receiving end of several assassination attempts. Why can't I say that? It took them an entire month to make her marriage a matter of national policy. Can you imagine? Like, I thought having an overbearing mother would be mad.